Hello, everyone. It's us again from Let's Read, and today we're talking about Plato's Philebus. So, I reckon if I was to nominate someone, would we all nominate Judith to kind of guide us?
Yes.
Yes, as the most competent and all that. I think if it were left up to me, it would be all over the shop. So let's not do that. And it was complicated enough. So. Yeah, I guess the starting point is just like Jody was inquiring about what's the background to Philebus and yeah, what's the setting, what's going on?
Okay, well, thanks, Courtney, and thanks everyone for being here. This is the first time I've read this dialogue, and yeah, as Jodie's pointed out, it looks as though, or scholarly consensus is, it's one of his latest works, Plato's latest works, along with the Laws, which is a very long work, and the Sophist and the Statesman, which we haven't read in our group, but kind of we probably should because they're also related works. There's a bit of and they're kind of referring to the one and the many, which also comes up in this dialogue with Philebus. But on the other hand, this dialogue is quite simple in the people involved. So there's Socrates and the person called Philebus, who was supposedly had the opinion that pleasure was the greatest good. So he was supposedly the person with his opinion, but for whatever reason, he's kind of not really involved, and the argument is really left to another young man called Protarchus. And as I was saying before we started recording, what's really nice about this dialogue is Protarchus is quite honest about the fact when which is most of the time, he doesn't understand what Socrates is on about. And he says, I don't know what you're on about, Socrates. And so, in a sense, we can all identify with Protarchus because Socrates then actually makes himself a bit clearer about what he's saying. So I think Protarchus is one of the more likable interlocutors.
And what do you think
But
that's
the
about? Because for me, that was really helpful. And it made me think like Socrates is presenting an argument where he's like hanging out with friends. It always feels casual, and he's having this kind of conversation that should be pretty easy to follow. But his mates, these young guys are like saying, "Look, I think I know what you're talking about, but you lost me there. Can you go over that again and make it so that I know what's going on?" And it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's really saying, Socrates is doing something very complicated for the context and the setting. And also, it's really helpful for the reader because it's a very complex kind of argument that he starts to present. And I guess it shows what a talented writer Plato is, because rather than just write a really dense metaphysical tract, he has the opportunity here to kind of mimic what would happen in a social gathering and kind of have to explain it.
Yeah,
May,
that's
may
exactly
I
right.
may I just mention too that it says that he is the son of Critias or Critias, which is interesting too because he was such a central figure in that period. If it's the same Critias, you know, so there is a quite a level of familiarity because Socrates was, in that like he was known to Critias and in a maybe negative way.
Yeah,
But
that's
yes.
exactly right. And as always, Socrates is tuned into all these familiar relationships and these friendship relationships. And you're right, Courtney. I think he makes it very social. It's kind of relaxed. There's no shame in not understanding what Socrates is talking about, first up, right? And this comes back to something that is covered in other dialogues, such as the Meno, where Socrates makes it clear that if being honestly confused is better than being confidently wrong. So it's better if we're not quite sure and we ask for a bit more clarification because um, Socrates is happy to provide that. And that's what's, yeah, I thought was really nice about this dialogue.
And I had another observation that I didn't realize till halfway through, and I could be completely wrong. See what you think. Um, it's almost as if Plato has a sense of his audience's feeling about his dialogue. So, sort of phenomenologically, when I start reading this stuff, there's always this heavy sigh, like, oh God, what the hell is Socrates going on about? And so, like, I experience this as a it takes ages to get into, and then it feels like eventually Socrates, through his baiting game, he manages to convince the interlocutor to buy in and join in, and once they join in, the work of dialectical discovery sort of begins, and that's when you feel a flow happening, you experience the flow of the text. But before that, with all the setup, it always feels heavy, disjointed, kind of argumentative and unnecessary. And I feel like Plato's quite aware of that, and he's kind of he presents it the way he does with his with the side characters, to kind of convey that he's quite willful, or he's doing it on purpose because he has to set up the dialogue in such a way as to get the buy-in from the person who was probably disinterested before they knew what was going on.
Yeah, I agree with you, Courtney. Absolutely. I think that's it's a uh, not self-deprecating style of Socrates, but that sort of it's like he's taking that modest position or something. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and we kind of start here in where it's actually Philebus's position that's going to be discussed, but Philebus isn't actually here to make his case. So Socrates is going to present what Philebus' position is, and apparently Philebus holds that what is good for all creatures is to enjoy themselves, to be pleased and delighted, and whatever else goes with that kind of thing. But he says, we, that's Socrates, contend that not these, but knowing, understanding, and remembering, and what belongs with them, right opinion and true calculations, are better than pleasure and more agreeable to all who can attain them.
Not that
Those who
it's a
can get
Sorry, but not that it's a big deal, but Philebus is actually here present, and he just hands it over to Protarchus for
yeah,
some reason.
that's right. Yeah, he just says, yeah, okay, whatever. But yeah, so Socrates is summarizing the two positions here. And those who can get the maximum benefit possible from having them, both those now alive and future generations. And then he checks in with Philebus. Am I representing you correctly? Yes, absolutely, Socrates. And so, yeah, now it's up to Protarchus to kind of carry on.
Oh, wait, I think I know why Philebus is present and not absent. I'm just going to have a guess. Because Socrates is going to go on and on and on about the three different parts all the time. And there's three parts, right? And Philebus represents pleasure. And he's kind of not really, he's not a winner. He's sitting out.
Yeah, maybe. That makes sense. I should say also, it says down the bottom, translated by Dorothea Frater. The translation on this dialogue is absolutely a masterclass, and particularly with the textual difficulties and the difficulties of the subject matter, it's an amazing job that the translator's done. All right, so he's set up the two different positions, that pleasure is the highest good, or that knowledge and intelligence is the highest good. And so that's the two different positions. And then Philebus, halfway down the next page, says, to my mind, pleasure wins and always will win, no matter what. But you must see for yourself, Protarchus. And Protarchus says, but now you've handed over the argument to us, Philebus. You can no longer control the agreements we make with Socrates, nor our disagreements. And Philebus concedes, you're right. I absolve myself of all responsibility and now called the goddess herself as my witness, which is kind of typical, right? He's the proponent of pleasure, so he's going to take no responsibility at all because that's not his priority. But he is going to try and enlist the goddess, that's Aphrodite, the goddess of love, on his side. And this is really interesting, I thought, where Socrates says, I always feel more than human dread over what names to use for the gods. It surpasses the greatest fear. So now I address Aphrodite by whatever title pleases her. So he makes the point that he's actually really pious about the gods and the goddesses. He's not casual about what name he calls them. And so Aphrodite, as the goddess of pleasure, is kind of implicated here. And so that's why Socrates is a bit hesitant, I suppose.
Yeah, I totally agree. I noticed that all the way through that for Socrates, because he compares it, doesn't he? Someone makes a comment about how the boys used to roll up and throw around something. I think they're talking about puns or some sort of ambiguity or something to do with the language. But it feels like Socrates is always approaching these subjects with the with with a pious heart. He's always thinking about what his agenda is, and we can presume that is not to offend the gods first, but to do justice to um, to this topic, which speaks of them, really, doesn't it?
Mm. Yeah, and later on, towards the end of the dialogue, Socrates comes out with a position that he's not against pleasure by any means. And that's partly because of his piety, I think. So it's just occurred to me, but there's a kind of an intertext with Euripides' play Hippolytus, which is about a young man, Hippolytus, the son of Theseus, who rejects Aphrodite altogether. So that is, he rejects love and sex and pleasure, essentially, all those things that kind of come as a package. And terrible things happen to Hippolytus, basically. And so in the kind of the Athenian cultural landscape, Aphrodite and pleasure and love had this divine status, and that's what Socrates goes on to assert, even as he argues the case for knowledge as well. So that's, yeah, I think the divine status of pleasure is something that will come out later in this dialogue.
And he refers to it, actually. He says that a little bit further in the text, he says that there were very wise men in tradition who frowned upon pleasure. Do you remember that bit? And
Yes.
he says they had a particular bias because of a harshness of their nature. So he wasn't saying that they're right to disparage pleasure. He's saying they had a certain predilection, a certain character flaw almost, that they couldn't see pleasure in its natural role or whatever, as a kind of divine part of nature, so to speak. And anything, he's really just sort of suggesting that uneducated or ignorant people misuse pleasure.
Yeah, exactly right. So he says right at the end of the page here, but as to pleasure, I know that it is complex. And just as I said, we must make it our starting point and consider carefully what sort of nature it has. And so that's what he's kind of continuing to do throughout the dialogue. He says, think about it. We say that a debauched person gets pleasure as well as that a sober-minded person takes pleasure in his very sobriety. Again, we say that a fool, though full of foolish opinions and hopes, gets pleasure, but likewise a wise man takes pleasure in his wisdom. But surely anyone who said in either case that these pleasures are like one another would rightly be regarded as a fool. So that's his position, that these two very different conditions are called by the same name, but they must be very different things. So, how does Socrates argue this? He wants to identify what it is. Sorry, Connie, I'll just say this quickly, that he wants to, and this is partway down the page in 13a there, for you say that all pleasant things are good, but he wants to say, well, what is the common element in the good and bad pleasures that allows you to call them all good? And this is, of course, immediately throws Protarchus off. It's like, what? What are you talking about? What are you saying, Socrates? Do you think anyone will agree to this who begins by laying it down that pleasure is the good? Do you think that he will accept it when you say that some pleasures are good and others are bad? And so, yeah, this is how Socrates goes about trying to identify what could be good about pleasure. Sorry, Courtney, go ahead.
Yeah, and following that, his starting point, this is where it feels frustrating, and this is what I think Plato knows feels frustrating, because he makes Protarchus frustrated, but it feels frustrating because, they can't decide on a starting point, and this always happens in these dialogues where but they're floundering to find a way in together where they can start to collaborate. And so it happens at about 14, where he starts talking about the problem of, if we talk about the branches of knowledge, it'll look like a plurality. So, he says, what we need to do is come up with a place where we can agree upon a starting point. And Protarchus agrees. This is where the kind of community aspect of dialectic starts to form around the nucleus of the argument. He says, yeah, you're right, Socrates, we must not let that happen, we can't let it get, be talking about different things and let the subject fall apart like that. He says, except the part about our being kept safe and sound, but I'm rather pleased by the fact that our theses are on the same footing. So let it be agreed that there can be many and unlike kinds of pleasure. So they come up with a starting point that's satisfactory for the both of them for the purposes of moving forward.
Yeah, well said. And actually, Protarchus is quite a because he's honest and determined and committed. He's a good interlocutor. He's not he's not acting in bad faith by any means. He's trying to understand. He's trying to get to a common position. He's trying to follow along and develop the argument.
I was really thinking about this three-part now, because Socrates is clearly playing the role of reason here, and that's why he's hard to keep up with. And Protarchus is the mixture. He's the mixture between Philebus's position, who's silent on the matter. So he's somewhere between pleasure and reason.
Yeah, good point. It's like Philebus doesn't give a damn. He's just, oh yeah, whatever. Because he's only interested in pleasure and his own enjoyment. Protarchus is actually committed to working along with Socrates, yeah. And so Socrates talks here about well, he's trying to explain the principle of the one and the many. So Protarchus says, do you mean this in the sense that someone says that I, Protarchus, am one by nature, but then also says that there are many me's and even contrary ones, when he treats me, who am one and the same, as tall and short, heavy and light, and endless such things? And Socrates kind of agrees. You, my dear Protarchus, are speaking about those puzzles about the one and the many that have become commonplace. So obviously it was a bit of a thing to talk about the one and the many and try and trip people up in this kind of thing.
Do you think
They're considered, sorry?
I think it's important. I'm curious too what you guys all think about this, but I think potentially the one and the many is one way of talking about two potentially contradictory positions. You have the idea of the forms, the one, the unchangeable, the static, the eternal, and then you have the many, which is the becoming, the idea of the concrete, the specific, that which comes to presence, the qualities over the singular measure, for example. Do you guys
Yeah, well,
read it that
yeah,
way?
yeah, for sure. So how are we to understand this idea of one? Socrates kind of goes on. Firstly, whether one ought to suppose there any are such unities truly in existence. So that's a big question to start with. Then again, how they are supposed to be, whether each one of them is always one and the same, admitting neither of generation nor of destruction, and whether it remains most definitely one and the same, even though it is afterwards found again among the things that come to be and are unlimited, so that it finds itself as one and the same in one and many things at the same time. That's one of those sentences was like, how did anyone translate that? Oh my God. It's like, oh. So I
But
think,
on that quickly, I agree with
yeah,
you. That must be treacherous to kind of translate. But on the other hand, I think thinking about it, and this is why I always am tempted to, maybe I'm wrong, but tempted to think of it as the eternal forms, the stable underlying one reality versus the specific concrete changeable, because it makes those sentences readable when you're thinking, how does the idea behind the thing that we find in the world as the many and the concrete and the specific and the ever changing, how does that one translate into the specific instances that we know and that we enjoy and that we participate with? You know, how does that happen? What does it mean? And that's kind of what Socrates is always trying to unpack and trying to kind of, because it's difficult theory to get behind. It's already cumbersome. And I think the Stoics, as you know, avoid it by getting rid of the forms altogether and just having the many, pretty much.
Yeah, that's right. And also, I think we've got to bear in mind, though, that someone like Protarchus in this situation, bearing in mind that, this is kind of fan fiction, it's not a verbatim account of a particular conversation. But Protarchus and any other interlocutors who might be hanging around, they wouldn't necessarily have any idea about Plato's theory of the forms, right? This could be completely new thinking to them, and that's partly why it's so confronting and confusing. It's because maybe this is the first time they've been presented with ideas like this.
And we're
And so,
gonna. Oh, sorry, I keep
oh yeah, I was
interrupting.
just going to say, Protarchus says, "Is this the first task we should try our hands out right now?" Socrates is like, "Oh,
Exactly.
okay. Is that the very first thing we're going to tackle here?" It's kind of this apprehension
Yeah.
that he's been thrown in right at the deep end.
But we know that, Plato's going to base his whole thing around this. He's going to, even later when he talks about his theory of the passions or his theory of perception, like it has to take into account this idea of the forms or the one and the many in the background. So he has to get it out of the way and he has to somehow sell it to them with some pretty easy examples early on, I think. But, and this is the thing where there's a kind of ebb and flow with reading these dialogues, because once you understand his argument, there's a flow, but then he tries to change up the game later on and he tries to bring in new ideas. Like he'll start then to talk about once you've already bought in, you can feel the buy-in, and then he says, so let's try this now on with a theory of perception, or let's try this now by looking at emotion and passion and the diseases of the soul. And it's like, nah, I don't like this. Like the way he tries to absorb everything into his metaphysics. That's when I sometimes get frustrated with him. And again, Plato knows this because he has Protachus getting frustrated with him too.
Yeah, it's so brilliant. But so anyway, they decide to leave Philebus out of it because he's not that interested. Quite so, says Socrates. Now, where should we make our entry into that complex and wide-ranging battle about this controversial issue? Is it not best to start here? And Protarchus is like, where? He has no idea, essentially, which is great. Socrates, by making the point that it's through discourse that the same thing flits around, becoming one and many in all sorts of ways, in whatever it may be that is said at any time, both long ago and now. Okay, so this is discourse. This is when the young people first get their taste of philosophy and they're absolutely intoxicated with it. And an argument, they're trying it out and they're trying to confuse other people and they make themselves a pain in the neck, pretty much. And but Protarchus says, "Oh, hang on, we're a crowd, we're all young, don't diss us, Socrates." Um, okay, so what does Socrates do? As so often in this kind of situation, he reverts to a myth. He takes it back to a kind of a traditional story. So it is a gift of the gods to men, or so it seems to me, hurled down from heaven by some Prometheus along with a most dazzling fire. And people of old, superior to us and living in closer proximity to the gods, have bequeathed us this tale, that whatever is said to be consists of one and many, having in its nature limit and unlimitedness. So what on earth does he mean by this? Okay, so some things are unlimited and some things have limit.
And it seems the unlimited, I don't know the fancy philosophy terms. Maybe they call them qualia, but I think they're kind of qualities, right?
Well, they can be, or they can be just comparative, sort of a verbal comparative rather than a specific mathematical ratio.
Yeah, I'm not talking about mathematical ratio, that's for sure. But like he says, hot and cold, or tall and short, and so on and
Yeah,
so forth. But limit, on the other hand, there's pretty much only a very limited number of them, like doubles, so or even numbers would be a limit because there could only be a limited number of them.
yeah. So he kind of gives this example in 17. And good old Protarchus again says, look, I need some further clarification. Okay, good. What I mean is clear in the case of letters, and you should take your clue from them since they were part of your own education. So this is something that everyone can understand. The sound that comes out of the mouth is one for each and every one of us, but is also unlimited in number. So our vocalizations, our sayables, as the Stoics would eventually call them, they're not specific, they're not limited, they're unlimited. But uh, when we sort of pin them down or identify them as particular letters and sounds, then they are limited. And similarly with music, when you can have music that's kind of what the birds do, right? Which is unlimited. But then when we have human music, we have pitch and we have intervals and we have rhythm, and those things apply limit to the unlimited. And if you didn't know about things such as pitch, interval, and rhythm, then you couldn't be considered knowledgeable about music. And here's the summary. So at the same time, they have made us, he means, I think, our forebears, they have made us realize that every investigation should search for the one and the many. For when you have mastered these things in this way, then you've acquired expertise there. And when you have grasped the unity of any of the other things there are, you have become wise about that. The boundless multitude, however, in any and every kind of subject, leaves you in boundless ignorance and makes you count for nothing and amount to nothing, since you have never worked out the amount and number of anything at all.
Yeah, that idea of the boundless many, see? So the limit, for example, like what you were talking about, the master musician or the one who teaches language or invents language, whatever, that the idea is that the limitless needs to be bounded because it's boundless. So it has to be put into a container, and the containers seem to be innovation, the arts and sciences, right?
Yeah, exactly. I should say too that one of those amazing coincidences, around about the time when I started reading this dialogue, I was reading an article about, um, well, broadly neuroscience, but basically the contention in the article was pointing out two different kinds of approaches in scientific articles. And one of them was about sort of comparisons, like, big or small, large or, hot or cold, whatever. And the other was a more sort of numerically based article. And so this idea of the unlimited and the limited is still with us in different forms. So again, as I say, Socrates often reverts to a kind of a traditional justification, and here again he goes to the very traditional Egypt, the myth of the god Thoth, or Thoth, as he's sometimes called. He was the first to discover that the vowels in that unlimited variety are not one but several, and again that there are others that are not voiced but make some kind of noise, and that they too have a number. And a third kind of letters he established, the ones we now call mute or silent letters, I guess. After this, he further subdivided the ones without sound or mutes down to every single unit. In the same fashion, he also dealt with the vowels and the intermediates until he had found out the number for each of them, and then he gave all of them together the name letter. And as he realized that none of us could gain any knowledge of a single one of them taken by itself without understanding them all, he considered that the one link that somehow unifies them all and called it the art of literacy.
Yeah.
Now, this is really interesting, I guess, from a kind of a history of language kind of point of view, because um, as far as we understand it, the ancient Egyptian language or expression of it was not a letter-based. It was a syllabic, and it was a pictorial text. So I think what Socrates or Plato is doing here is kind of retrojecting Greek ideas, or Greek or maybe Phoenician ideas about letters back onto Egypt, which perhaps weren't actually in any sense accurate. But I guess the broader point remains that in order to understand language, we do have to understand these separate elements, letters, sounds, sayables, which make it up. So that's what imparts limit to language.
But also, there's something divine going on in the background here, and this
Yeah.
Thoth always has been recycled. Thoth appears in the Phaedrus, I think. I'm pretty
Yes.
sure, and it's a play on the same story. A certain king goes and he sees Thoth, but instead in the Phaedrus he's talking about how the king criticizes Thoth for inventing writing because now people are going to misuse it or whatever, rather than do conversation and dialectic or whatever. They're going to prepare speeches instead of speaking from their hearts or whatever. So it's a different thing, but it's connected, I think, because here, if you know anything about Thoth too, Thoth not only invented writing, he invented mathematics, he invented time pretty much, but he invented magic and and the idea of Thoth is that he even because of writing records the fate of the souls in the book of the dead in the underworld. So there's a lot going on in here of a magical nature, I think, of a kind of divine nature, of a mystery nature. So there's this sense that how is it possible that from sounds this divine thing was able to capture something that could be taught to other men in such a way that they could communicate and affect each other's souls, stir up their emotions, cast spells on one another, the kind of causative logoi that could penetrate the soul and have an effect upon them. I think it's a really interesting piece and again, it shows you how Socrates is always on thinking about the gods in the background and the numinous, almost the magical, not magical, but the forms, the hidden part, the stuff below the surface.
Absolutely. And also when we think about it, when I had the example earlier of the unlimited as being what the birds do, their songs are not in any sense what we would call a language, but they are a form of communication. But humans are unique in having language. That's one of the things that makes humans unique. And so yes, that's another way in which it's linked to the divine. Courtney, I think you're absolutely right.
And part of this is that it can be taught. These
Yes.
things, you can take something formless, give it a structure and a clothing that somehow partakes in the meaning of the form. Somehow the form still, the letters partake in the power of the form somehow, and it can be taught to man. And this is the whole idea about to do with sciences and things like that, to do with episteme, the idea that you can know things because they partake in the essence behind them.
So now Philebus pops up again. And once he's a bit he says he's talking to Protarchus. I understand this even better than what came before, at least how it hangs together. But he's not satisfied with Socrates' explanation. So then Socrates does a bit of a recap. As we were saying, this is one of the good things about this dialogue, that Socrates from time to time does a bit of a summary. Did we not embark on an investigation of knowledge and pleasure to find out which of the two is preferable? Yes, indeed. And we do say that each of them is one, right? This is the very point in question to which our preceding discussion obliges to give an answer, to show how each of them is one and many, and how instead of becoming unlimited straight away, each one of them acquires some definite number before it becomes unlimited. So Protarchus is confused again.
Can I just say quickly here that one and the many thing, it got me thinking about categories and groups, umbrella, structures over top of the many. And, and it made me think about Aristotle, because Plato ended up having, time with Aristotle, and look at what Aristotle did in terms of one and the many, the categories were vast that he undertook to document. So, like that must have been, like you say before, Judith, it was a big idea at the time, these overarching ideas and how everything splits up under it into subgroups and things.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Jodie. So Socrates kind of says, unless we're able to do this for every kind of unity, similarity, sameness, and their opposite, in the way that our recent discussion has indicated, none of us will ever turn out to be any good at anything. So that's a big call, isn't it? But Protarchus acknowledges that.
Well, it makes sense, because if you were just
Yeah,
flooded with an infinite number of potential options that don't hang together in any meaningful way, then how can you move forward?
yeah. And Protarchus gives it his own summary now here. He says, you, Socrates, have granted this meeting to all of us, and yourself to boot, in order to find out what is best of all human possessions. Now, Philebus advocated that it is pleasure, amusement, enjoyment, and whatever else there is of this kind. You, on the contrary, deny this for all of them, but rather propose those other goods we willingly and with good reason keep reminding ourselves of, so that they can be tested as they are lying side by side in our memory. You claim, it seems, that the good that should by right be called superior to pleasure, at least, is reason, as well as knowledge, intelligence, science, and everything that is akin to them, which must be obtained rather than Philebus's candidates. Now, after both these conflicting positions have been set up against each other, we threatened you in jest that we would not let you go home before the deliberation of these questions had reached a satisfactory limit. But since you made a promise and committed yourself to us, we therefore insist, like children, that there is no taking it back a gift properly given. So give up this way of turning against us in the discussion here. What are you talking about? What are you doing? It's kind of funny that Socrates is now, hang on, what are you saying? Protarchus, your way of plunging us into difficulties and repeating questions to which we at present have no proper answer to give you. But we should not take it that the aim of our meeting is universal confusion. If we cannot solve the problem, you must do it, for you promised. It is up to you to decide whether for this purpose you need to divide off different kinds of pleasure and knowledge, or can leave that out if you're able and willing to show some other way to settle the issues of our controversy. So this is, you're mentioning, Courtney, this frustration that Protarchus is manifesting here about, going around in circles and not getting anywhere.
And it seems to be a typical stratagem of Socrates, because he gets them to put him in a situation where he has to answer, and then he pretends usually that, oh, poor me, I'm always the one who has to do the hard work, but fine, since I'm here, I'll have a go at it.
And so just as Socrates often appeals to myth, often he also appeals to dreams. It is a doctrine that once upon a time I heard in a dream, or perhaps I was awake, that I remember now concerning pleasure and knowledge, that neither of the two is the good, but there is some third thing which is different from and superior to both of them. But if we can clearly conceive now that this is the case, then pleasure has lost its bid for victory, for the good could no longer turn out to be identical with it, right? Right. Okay, we're making some progress. So there's got to be some kind of mix.
But you know what's cool about this too? Again, it highlights something about their culture, right? Because if you told me, Judith, that you just had a dream and you think you know the answer to it now because you heard a voice in a dream, I'd go, whatever, probably. But they accept this as a plausible way of getting out of the impasse, as if the gods had given him something that would help them move forwards, So one, everyone has a kind of sense of piety in the background, but two, they recognize Socrates as a potential candidate for being a spokesperson for the gods.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, so okay, so we're going to push on. Okay, so Socrates just insists there's some small matters we ought to agree on first, though. What are they? Whether the good is necessarily bound to be perfect or not perfect. So this is kind of quite a technical point. Does the good have to be perfect?
Well, we know the answer, don't we?
Well, kind of. But Socrates, starts a separate inquiry on this. So in 21 here, Socrates says, would you find it acceptable to live your whole life in enjoyment of the greatest pleasures? Why, certainly, says Protarchus. And would you see yourself in need of anything else if you had secured this altogether? No. But look, might you not have some need of knowledge, intelligence, and calculation, or anything else that's related to them? How so? If I had pleasure, I would have them all in all. And living like that, you could enjoy the greatest pleasures throughout your life. Why should I not? Since you would not be in possession of either reason, memory, knowledge, or true opinion, must you not be in ignorance, first of all, about this very question, whether you were enjoying yourself or not, given that you were devoid of any kind of intelligence? So that was a clever riposte from Socrates. Protarchus agrees, necessarily. Socrates, moreover, due to lack of memory, it would be impossible for you to remember that you ever enjoyed yourself and for any pleasure to survive from one moment to the next, since it would leave no memory. But not possessing right judgment, you would not realize that you are not enjoying yourself even when you do. And being unable to calculate, you could not figure out any future pleasures for yourself. You would thus not live a human life, but the life of a mollusk or one of those creatures in shells that live in the sea. Is this what would happen? Or can we think of any other consequences besides these? Now, I was thinking about this. I'm not sure that Socrates' argument here actually holds, because if we think about, for example, and we do have a bit more about this later on, but if we think about a baby, for example, enjoying its food or its cuddles, it may not actually have a memory of previous times because it's really just only come into the world. So, but it still enjoys its feeding and its cuddles. So I'm not sure that, but is that what Socrates means by the life of a mollusk? Is the life of a baby like the life of a mollusk? I'd say probably
Pretty
not.
much. Pretty much.
But there's a thing.
Well, you're
though,
grasping that nettle, Jody, but I'm not sure that I do. What does everyone think?
that might not be the best bit in the I don't like what he does when he talks about memory later, but I think the reason why this represents a good attack on pleasure is because everyone agrees so far that the good is perfect and the good is sufficient. And what he's trying to show here is that the life of pleasure is not sufficient because you'd need to have reason to understand the argument in the first place. So that already violates it from being the good. And also, it's not perfect. So in both accounts, what he's doing with pleasure in here is showing you it can't conform to the category of the good, the perfect and the sufficient, which he'll try and show that reason's a better candidate, but he also they end up kind of going, well, that's not perfect either, but they'll revisit it.
Yeah, so yet again, Protarchus is left speechless. Socrates, this argument has left me absolutely speechless for the moment. All right, so now it's time to inspect the life of reason. So Socrates says, whether any one of us would choose to live in possession of every kind of intelligence, reason, knowledge, and memory of all things, while having no part, neither large nor small, of pleasure or of pain, living in total insensitivity of anything of that kind.
Because it has to be sufficient. That's that point.
Yes, yeah. But Protarchus is kind of stymied because he doesn't think either of these forms of life are choice-worthy. So, but what about a combination? Protarchus says, you mean a mixture of pleasure with reason and intelligence? Right. Well, Protarchus says everybody would certainly prefer this life to either of the other two without exception. Okay, so now
Now
of the
there's a
three lives,
complication.
Go ahead, Connie.
Well, the complication is that he says here on 410, yeah, certainly that of the three lives offered to us, two are not sufficient or worthy of choice for either man or animal. So there's a third option, which is the mixture, right? And then the complication comes in the form, if I remember correctly, that neither reason nor pleasure look like they're going to win this battle. But on the other hand, it is important which comes second place for some reason. And Socrates believes that pleasure will come third place and be the clear loser, while reason will most likely come second place. And it's interesting that he wants to do this kind of three-part thing over and over and over again. So that's an interesting topic on itself. I think he gets to 4 parts soon, but carry on.
Yeah, that's right. So Socrates concludes, enough has been said, it seems to me, to prove that Philebus's goddess and the good cannot be regarded as one. But Philebus says, well, nor is your reason the good, Socrates, and the same complaint applies to it. Okay, so neither of them can be the good. So now we have this idea about, well, what then? Socrates says, had we better not leave her, that's the goddess, alone, rather than subject her to the most exacting test and give her pain by such an examination? You talk nonsense, Socrates. Protarchus is quite bold about that. And so there's this idea about pain and pleasure and how they're related to each other.
There,
All
did you
right,
see
so
the joke? Did you see the joke at the bottom of the page there, previous, where he says, "Oh, why? Because I said the impossible, giving pain to pleasure."
yeah, that's right. But it, he gets us to think about these conjunctions of pain and pleasure and the relationship between them. It's very thought-provoking, I
Yeah.
think.
Can I just quickly mention too, when I was reading through all of this discussion on pain and pleasure, and they were talking a lot about, is pleasure the absence of pain? And it made me think of the Epicureans, and it brought in that whole thing about, the nature of pleasure being absence of pain. Anyway, I just thought, just raise that as we go into that section.
But as you bring that up, Jody, you'll find that he makes some very strong pronouncements that people who think that that the good life is the absence of pain, or that pleasure is the absence of pain, are misguided. He makes a very
Yes,
strong point.
that's the point he's making. He's speaking in a way that is subtly against the Epicurean argument. Yeah.
Mind you, I don't think the Epicureans had made their argument yet.
No, that's right. But they would have been aware of this dialogue. I mean, I think you're right, Jody. That's what occurred to me as well. And it's like the Epicureans kind of grasped that nettle. They really, they may have well taken their starting point from this dialogue and absolutely chosen to embrace that.
And I think that's the problem with sometimes with Plato's work is he makes the situation so dependent on his metaphysics, and it's complex. It's very complex that the guys who come along and want to simplify it can kind of go, well, no, he's wrong about all that, And so when they take out that whole, the body can feel pains that the soul can't, but there are some pains that can penetrate the soul and the body, or only the soul can feel them, or only the body can feel them. When they get rid of all that, it changes the structure of what's possible with his argument too.
Yeah, I think you're right, Connie. So this is funny. All right, so let us now take, Socrates says, these as, sorry, we agreed earlier that the God had revealed a division, this is Thuth, remember, revealed a division of what is into the unlimited and the limit. Let us now take these as two of the kinds, while treating the one that results from the mixture of these two as our third kind. But I must look quite a fool with my distinctions into kinds and enumerations. This self-deprecating move from Socrates, and Protarchus, as always, is confused. What are you driving at? Socrates, that we seem to be in need of yet a fourth kind. So what does he mean by that? Let us look at the cause of this combination of these two together and posit it as my fourth kind in addition to those three. So this is kind of a interesting categorization that Socrates now proposes to add a fourth thing. So we've got, first of all, pleasure, then knowledge, then the mixture of the two, and then whatever causes there to be the mixture. So this is a kind of an interesting way of dividing things up, but he's kind of self-deprecating about it.
But there's something really interesting about the structure of your argument here too. Like I noticed, I don't know if you guys will agree or not, but the way he approaches all this is very inductive. So rather than do what we would do nowadays, most likely, and have an overarching kind of hypothesis that we state first and then try to prove or disprove, he builds things up from the ground upwards. So he'll go, oh, I've got this principle. It necessarily follows that there must be the second part. And what happens if they mix together? There's your third part, but we're missing something. We're missing the fourth part. And I think what's very clever about this approach is that it's natural to the human mind, that it's phenomenologically clean. It's the way that we go about building up impressions. So we see things and we assemble details in order to understand them. We actually don't do what the scientific method sort of says is a better form of reasoning, that deductive approach. We don't naturally do that. We don't have a conclusion about an impression and then unpack it to discover it what it is. It's actually the other way around, which means I think that's why these ancient Greeks have such an interest in the role of perception, in the role of getting perceptions right, because at each step of the inductive process you could make a mistake. And that will lead to disaster at the end. The final conclusion will be wrong. So there's something, if people were to say, oh, they're silly, this is no way to make an argument, it's better to use a deductive approach, that's why the modern scientific world is so much better. Actually, what you've got here is something that grounds their investigation in actual naturalistic process of making impression formation as the human being does it anyway.
Yeah, I totally
Nicely
agree,
put.
Courtney. Yeah. Okay, so now Socrates kind of goes back to his ideas about the unlimited and the limited. He says, attention then. The matter I'm asking you to attend to is difficult or controversial, but attend to it nevertheless. Check first in the case of the hotter and the colder whether you can conceive of a limit or whether the more or less do not rather reside in